Let's turn now to Greg Buchanan, the author of 16 Horses. Now, we've got such an erudite trio here. Greg studied English at Cambridge and completed his PhD at King's College London in identification and ethics. He's also a graduate of UEA's Creative Writing MA. In 2019, Greg was named to Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 list, which identifies future leaders. In addition to fiction, he has a background in scripting best-selling, award-winning computer games. So this debut, 16 Horses, is a literary thriller that opens with a farmer finding the heads of 16 stolen horses buried in his field. The ensuing investigation is handled by a forensic veterinarian called Cooper Allen and Detective Alec Nichols. Now, this investigation quickly reveals a town that has been scarred by decades of environmental, economic, and emotional trauma, and a chain of horrific crimes. The dying town is both literally and symbolically infected by a legacy of abuse, suicide, and murder. Greg, you've given us everything. Welcome. And do you also want to start us off with a bit of a reading for the flavor of the piece?
I'm going to unfortunately buck the trend and do something very slightly later in the novel, just because it's nice and concise, but also makes sense in itself.
Okay.
This is chapter 6. The investigation forces have begun at this point, but you don't really need to know anything else for it to make sense. The tents shook in the storm, barely holding up against the onslaught of rain. Already water leaked into them, coalescing near the head of a young mare, a chestnut-coloured horse who had been called Sally. She had been her owner's best friend. It was hard to see any of this. There were no streetlights, not this far from town. If you stood in the fields that night, you would not have been able to see anyone, even if they were standing right next to you, even if they were looking right at you. You wouldn't see their grey-hooded gas mask. You wouldn't see their tight rubber gloves. It's a beautiful thing to be seen. Stars dead for millennia kept faith. They walked out into the night. There you go.
Thank you. This is another book that it's very hard to shake off once you've closed the pages. It's so visceral and so powerful. Now, every single crime writer I've ever interviewed in a long chain of interviews has said, it doesn't matter how many humans they kill. The minute they harm a dog or a cat or any other animal, they get hate mail. And you have killed 16 horses in this book. But I also know that, all joking aside, you're very, very interested in the vulnerability of non-human animals. So I wonder if you can talk about how that inspired you to approach this novel.
Sure. I mean, it's been an interesting one because I started work on this during the UVA course actually, and originally it was going to be a bit more. So this kind of set of crimes was going to happen, but it was going to be in the context of other things going on in the community as well. The horse, sort of in a particular workshop, I did the horse bit opening, and that got a much better response to everything else. So, I mean, for anyone watching who's interested in UVA, it was directly led to everything, which is nice. So everyone was like, you just do that. The other thing's overcomplicated, focus on that plot line. So I was sort of led to it partly by the reader response at the time of focusing on that plot line as my main thing. But in terms of the vulnerability of non-humans, it was interesting working on it because part of the conceit of the novel was if you treated the death of an animal like the death of a human, in terms of with the crime tropes and the genre tropes. And there's a lot of fun that you could have in terms of such a novel, in terms of, I mean, they're talking about these 60 decapitated horse heads while sitting in a pub at one point with a stag's head on the wall right behind them and stuff like that, or eating meat at various points, or loads of different things which don't make any sense. Or at one point, in response to certain events in the novel, some sheep get culled and like hundreds of them are being killed. And once again, it's sort of this there's a lot of strangeness if you sort of I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of strangeness in our society's treatment of non-human animals anyway, but that you could really, as it's often said about crime fiction, that it can explore lots of different things, or in society. I thought this was quite an interesting point. And also in terms of that I did an article for Crime Reads recently where I thought about it in a bit more detail and kind of argued it out a bit, because it's been interesting about you. So I haven't received any like direct hate mail, but there's been a kind of sort of breathless quality to some sort of Goodreads comments and so on, where it's like, stop, don't read this. If you're an animal lover, don't read this. It's horrible about animals and so on. And it's been interesting seeing some of those comments, because I mean, for anyone who checks my Twitter profile, I think the other day I posted a picture of my two cats in a pram that was walking around outside. So in terms of my own personal life, I've got pets. I've worked with animals, and I'm quite obsessed with my pets. And the novel came from a place of trying to treat that seriously and trying to think like, what's one of the worst things that could happen in terms of emotionally, and explore that and treat it as fully seriously as it could be. But it's interesting in that there's a certain hypocrisy in our real life response to it that the novel was also trying to think about, in terms of despite the fact that we really can't, as you were saying, so people could tolerate a pile of corpses, but a pile of animals that are dead, you couldn't, not humans, are upsetting. But in real life, our response is completely different to that. As in terms of legal kind of punishments for killing animals are like barely anything, to be honest. The courts are really loath to even ban people from keeping animals, even if they've abused them. Like, it's really like it's easier to get. I think it's easier to be banned from like having a gun than it is from being banned to having pets. Like, which probably makes sense actually. Sorry, now that I think about that. But there's a lot of very strangeness in the law surrounding it, and in terms of even recently. So there was the big Croydon cat killer case that the book talks about briefly, where hundreds of cats were killed across the UK, and it was suspected there was an individual doing it, and the police determined eventually that, oh no, it was foxes, because fox DNA was found there and so on. And there's a bit of a debate even in the veterinary kind of community about whether that actually was foxes responsible for that number. Like, probably some of them, but not like that the sheer number. But in the same sort of week, a few weeks after my book came out, the Brighton cat killer got sent to jail for just a few short years, I think, for killing like dozens of animals. And although there are sentences for these things, they're not really pushed. So that sort of the general atmosphere, and like, why do we treat animals this way? Like, why, in terms of why are we so funny about them in terms of the fictional response, was sort of a real driver for thinking about it. But it's also interesting because it's what you were saying, Katrina, about serial killers and their pets, and people and their animals, because there's also the flip side of it, that people often there is an association sometimes between people who can abuse animals and then go on to commit other crimes from that perspective, and like, what is their relationship with what is generally is the relationship of these types of people with animals, and either positively or negatively, there's some kind of association there that is present, but for some reason no one ever writes about in that kind of detail. So that was all a big kind of driving force for it. I think also in terms of how I approached it in the novel, possibly in a way which there's one chapter in particular, I think, that can upset some people in that regard, is I wanted to not just have the fact of the animals having died. For example, the Godfather, horse's head is also chopped off, but it doesn't, you don't know anything about that horse. It doesn't go into any, there's no background to it. So I wanted to have a feeling of the context that these animals had in the community. So it covers them. And very early on, it focuses on one of the horse owners and this a carriage rider who was quite close with that animal, and the animal was mentioned here. And I wanted that to be kind of you to feel it, like how they're treated, rather than, oh no, my property is dead. I wanted to feel like a named animal who had a personality is dead. And also I wanted there to show positive interactions with animals, which I think in many ways is interesting in terms of why the whole resistance to having anything bad happen to animals is there. There's this one chapter, a few chapters in, where someone sort of plays with a dog, and nothing actually bad happens in the chapter. It's just there's certain things, especially towards the end, to make it quite clear that something menacing is going on in the context of this, and possibly will happen right afterwards, and sort of makes it clear what that will be at the end. But you don't actually see anything. It's just him playing with the dog. But this is the chapter, I think, in particular, that some people can be like, kind of nope out the situation, even though, once again, there is nothing violent happening. It's just someone playing with an animal. But it was very important to me to show that, in the same way, I guess, where some fiction can be critiqued for the trope of for example, sometimes violent death of women in novels can be critiqued for sometimes being sensationalist, sometimes not, and how it's dealt with. But I think like treating the victims of the crime seriously and giving them emotional weight and making them characters in their own right, exploring it, was something that I found important when writing this. And as soon as I sort of went ahead with that aspect and sort of pumped that up, I think I sort of found my footing with it quite a lot, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And just before I open the conversation up and bring the other two back in, I just want to ask you, you know, one of the things that crime writers are always looking for is a fresh take. Now, I've read hundreds of crime novels. I've never read one with a forensic veterinarian. I didn't even know there were forensic veterinarians. Can you quickly tell us what inspired that?
Sure.
I think it's rather close to home.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah. So my partner slash fiance, she is a vet. She's not a detective vet though, which I sort of hate sad because we were at an event once and I think some people thought she was a detective vet for various reasons, which I'm sure she didn't want to. So yeah, she's a vet, so I know a lot about the profession and the way they work with animals in that sense. Even in the profession, actually, despite the fact that there's a lot of departments of veterinary forensics and veterinary pathology at a lot of universities, a lot of vets aren't actually aware of that as a side of the profession either. I found out about it when I was so originally the character was just going to be a vet. But then I was looking into sort of doing my research online, discovered the field. And then I went to a training weekend that was designed for vets to learn more about it. But there were also police officers there. There were people kind of in the industry who wanted to know more about how the process worked. Very traumatizing event. In terms of, you were talking about watching horrifying materials and sort of being a bit scarred. It was mainly that I thought I was desensitized to certain visual things that I was not in terms of the images shown on the overhead projector. Obviously, everyone else seemed kind of okay with it because I guess they sort of are doing medical procedures all the time, but I was sort of skinned animals and so on. But it was really interesting in terms of seeing they talked us through the entire. I have a certificate about it as well, which is quite fun. So I can I have a veterinary qualification as well for this little weekend training CPD thing. It went through the full life cycle of what they would do on cases. And with my character, I've very much clapped a couple of roles into one, which I'm pretty sure everyone does for these kinds of things. You don't necessarily want a team of people doing something. So it's sort of two different jobs in one, really. So the kind of a lot of the book is quite authentic about what someone in that role would do in terms of visiting the crime scene, photographing it, looking over evidence. They'll often work on cases that animals can be the victims in. They will also sometimes consult on cases with human deaths or where there's animal evidence. They talked us through. Luckily for my purposes, one of the post-mortem lectures was actually about a horse that had been decapitated, which obviously poor horse, but I could not imagine my luck from a research perspective of oh my God, in terms of, because they talked very specifically through specifically what they did. So I was furiously writing at this point. So that really helped me and realize what the profession was like. I also, there's a veterinary forensics expert who then read the manuscript and helped go through it. It was quite interesting in that I wanted these horses to have been killed, obviously, because the novel works in that sense. But the actual murder weapon, the logistics of physically doing that with such large animals was I didn't really know what I was going to do with that and stuff. But because I've veterinary forensics people have actually worked on this, I was able to actually ask for advice about how would someone physically, not in terms of motivation, how would someone physically do this? And I got this very in-depth guide to how to actually do that crime, which was kind of quite useful as a writer and so on. And I think in terms of, as much as the novel is about non-human animals and their place in our sort of society, the veterinary profession, it was quite important for me to write about that in general anyway, not just because of my partner and her experiences and what I've observed her and her friends, because I've hung out with them quite a lot as well. But there's a statistic very early on in the novel about veterinarians have 4 times the suicide rate of the average population, and twice that of doctors who already have an elevated rate. And why that is fascinating to me, but also why so few people know about that. And what the cultural perception of veterinarians is, because we get kind of James Herriot is the one who comes to mind. You were saying about kind of if a cat's featured, would that just be cozy? It's quite fun because I think on my Amazon in America it says cozy animal crime. I was okay, so sort of the genre, but the involvement of animals or vets is immediately seen as somehow being cutesy or something, or very idyllic. And it's interesting in terms of James Herriot, in his first book, because obviously it's semi-fictionalized, semi-based on semi his life. It's got some more negative stuff about the profession, but still pretty positive. But then as it goes on, it becomes pretty much just positive because that's what people want from that kind of from that portrayal. And just the sheer number of vets and the mental health struggles the vets go through in their profession that are quite unique to that profession were really interesting to me. and I thought that kind of echoed well with, you know, the crime trope of treating an animal death as serious as a human death. Well, who would you have instead of the forensic person? Blah, and then that all sort of combined together.
Yeah. Brilliant.